Good evening, everyone. I want to give it a few moments for some people to join, and then we will end up getting started with the lesson this evening. If you would send a message, let me know that you're watching so I can see who is on here. If you have any questions, feel free to submit, and I will do my best to answer them. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking at some things about the Great Tribulation, World War III, and the timeline in which it begins. So, I would like for us to be able to turn to Scripture. Glad you all got the send out. So it was got things going with that. What I'd like for us to do, let me get this real quick, and then we will get started. What I'd like for us to do is to turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 9. What I want to talk about really is when is World War III going to happen? When is it going to occur? Many people do not know exactly when it will transpire. They don't know what to expect. Some believe that World War III will happen after the Great Tribulation. Some believe beforehand, and so hopefully that from Scripture we could end up seeing a few things. And as we go through it and we study it out, I believe that we would be able to understand exactly when the World War III will happen. It's not a question of will it happen. It's just when will it happen. So it's very important that we understand this. Now, in Revelation chapter 9, starting with verse 15, it says that, and the four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of man, or the third part of humanity. Okay, the thing is that whenever we look at this, the angels, we know that angels, according to the book of Hebrews, are ministering spirits. But these angels are not ministering spirits. These angels here mentioned in Revelation 9:15 are the ones that were bound. They fell with, they rebelled with Satan. These are part of that 1/3 that had rebelled with him. And so, and that it's talking about these angels, that these are not good angels. These are demons. Okay. And so it says here, it says that they are bound, and it says, but they will be loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of man, the third part of humanity. So we, in 1914 through 1918, we ended up having World War I. And it was like 8.2 million people that had died from that war. And out of that war, we ended up coming up with the League of Nations, that was formed. And then approximately 20 years later, in 1935, we ended up having World War II. And coming out of that, we ended up having 52 million people that had died. And so from that, we ended up getting the United Nations. And so now we see here that there will be another world war, and 1/3 of human population will die. So it's like 1 out of every 3 people will end up dying. And we'll look at, where the war begins, where it's going to originate from, and where it's going to spread to. Okay, so we'll end up getting into that a little bit later on into this into this message. Now, the thing is that the Euphrates rivers, because that's what it's talking about, is that it says that they were bound in this in the great river Euphrates. Well, the Euphrates River begins its trek or its journey from the southern part of Turkey, and it works its way down into Syria, and then it goes into the northern boundary of Iraq, and then it ends up merging with the Tigris River, which flows into the Persian Gulf. Okay. And so from that, we end up understanding that, that's where these angels are at this point in time. And that's where this World War III, this is where it's going to originate from, is from the river Euphrates. All right. And the thing is that we understand that in 2003, whenever we ended up sending our troops over there to help stabilize the situation, there's been nothing but turmoil going on between Islam and us, between Iraq and that area with the United States. Now, the thing is that what we end up seeing here is that if we end up reading on down into verse 16, it says, and the number of the army, it says, for to slay the third part of men, and the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, and I heard the number of them. This 200,000 is really 200 million. So the army can be 200 million is what it's talking about. Now, Mao Zedong, whenever he was over China, he stated in a book that he could easily have 200 million people that would be able to go to war at any one time. And I mean, it's just kind of ironic that the number that he says that he could come up with is exactly the number that's mentioned in Scripture. Now, I am not saying that, they will be involved in this, which there is some internal evidence from the book of Revelation that they will be, but I'm not saying that they are. We also know that Islam could end up bringing in 200 million people as well to end up fighting. Okay, so we have to look at that. Now, the thing is that what I want us to get into is that in Revelation chapter 9, which we read verse 15 and we read verse 16, is that it says at verse 17, and it says, and thus I saw the horses in the vision. Now, it's talking about John, the Apostle John, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and brimstone, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions. And out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. Now, if you notice, it said that they have the heads of lions. Now, in our first lesson that we ended up going over, you end up seeing that, lion is Great Britain. Okay, and so we know that things are going to come out of that. So it says that the head of the horses were as the heads of lions. Okay, so Great Britain plays a part in this. Now, this is coming against Israel. Okay, this third war, it's mainly going to go against Israel. That's the reason why, that's why it originates over there from the Euphrates River, from Iraq, and then it ends up spreading out. Now, the thing is that before the great, when is this going to happen? When is this is a very difficult teaching to talk about because, you end up having a 1/3 of the human population that's going to die. That's going to pass away because of this. And so, you're looking at what is it? 2.7 million, I believe, or billion is what it is that's going to end up dying, from this, because the population right now is like 7.7 billion people. And so we're looking at 1/3 of that, that's like 2.7 billion. And so there's no way that this war can be restrained or contained in the area of the Euphrates River. Okay, so that leads us to believe because so many dying, so many people going to be killed from this war, that that war is going to spread out and it's going to go into all the world itself. Okay, because it clearly says in verse 15, it says to slay the third part of men. So it's not talking about any one area. So we understand that. Now, the thing is, it says that he's seen the horses and so forth. It says in verse 18, it says, by these three was the third part of the men killed, by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouth. So the question is, when is this going to happen? I believe that the war will end up happening prior to the signing of the 7-year covenant. Okay. The reason why I say that is because if the covenant that is to be signed between the Antichrist and Israel, okay, is to be a covenant of peace. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 says that there is a covenant for a week, which is a 7-year period. So we understand that. But what I'm looking at is that prior to the signing of this covenant, what's going to happen is that we're going to have this war. And then that's when the Antichrist is going to end up coming out and saying, look, we need to do something. We need to have one person that's going to be in control of everything so there won't be a war anymore. That's the reason why we ended up getting the League of Nations, is because they ended up, from the war, they came out, which we know that didn't work very well, because 20 years later you had World War II. Then you ended up getting the United Nations that came out from that. Okay. And so I believe that with the World War III, there's going to be this bloodshed. 1/3 of the population, humanity is going to really be distressed. They're not going to know what to do. And so this human figure comes forth, this godlike figure comes forth, and he's like, look, this is what we need to do. And so that's the reason why I'm believing that World War III is going to come before the signing of the covenant. Because when we end up signing the covenant, for the 7 years, we're going to be able to build our temple in Israel. We're going to be able to put it up there, on the Temple Mount. Okay. And so we end up seeing that. Now, the thing is that, many people teach that the Great Tribulation is 7-year period. Okay. We're going to be looking at some scripture here in just a moment. And from that, we'll be able to get an understanding of exactly how long the Great Tribulation is. Okay. We do know that the signing of the covenant is for 1 week. It is for 1 year, 1 full year. Now, if we end up going to the book of, let's stay here in Revelation right now. Okay. In chapter 9, we're looking at this. This is the 6th angel. All right. In verse 13, it says, and the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the 6th angel, which had the trumpet. So this is the 6th trumpet sound. We know that there's 7 trumpets. So this is the 6th trumpet. It says, loose the 4 angels, which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the 4 angels were loosed, or they were released, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the 3rd part of men. So we know there's an appointed time, for this war to happen. And before, like I said, before the signing of the covenant, before the peace treaty, I believe this war is going to happen. So we end up seeing that this happens during the 6th trumpet sound. Okay, the 6th angel, he sounds a trumpet, and we end up, going into this, we have this war. Now, the thing is that how long is the Great Tribulation? This has to be before the Great Tribulation. Okay, this is during, we at least have the 7-year period. So we know that this is either before the covenant signing or just right after the covenant signing. Okay, and this is the first part of that 7-year period. Well, the Great Tribulation is going to happen for 3.5 years. Okay, we have various passages of scripture that indicate such. If we turn to Daniel chapter 7, we end up coming up to where he's, talking to this angel, trying to figure some stuff out. And he asked right here in verse 25, it says, and he shall speak great words against the Most High, talking about the Antichrist. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of times. Okay, so we see here that a time is 1 year, times, plural, is 2 years, and then half a time is 6 months. Okay, so 1 plus 2 is 3, so it's 3.5 years. Okay, now remember, this is coming from a Jewish calendar. All right, a Jewish calendar, every 3 years it changes. Okay, you have throughout the year you have 12 months, but then that third year you have 13 months. Okay, so just to let you know that any calculation that we do has to be based on a Jewish calendar, which a month is 29 to 30 days. Okay, whereas versus here in the United States, and most of the country, or most of the world, a calendar is based upon 12 months being 30, 31 days, except, the month of February, which, is a leap year. Every 4 years it changes to 29 days. So the thing is, we have to remember that the calculation of anything that we do in Scripture is based upon the Jewish calendar. Okay, and so we have to know the time frame of those months. So anyway, we understand here that it's time, times, and half a time. So that's going to be 3.5 years. The other passage that we see is in Revelation chapter 13. Okay, in chapter 13, verse 5, we end up coming up with this right here, where it states that it says, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things to blaspheme and blasphemy. He's talking about the Antichrist. And power was given to him to continue 42 months. That's 3.5 years. Okay, 42 months is 3.5 years. Okay, so we see that once again. The other passage that we see is in Revelation chapter 12, and that's in verse 6. And it says here, in Revelation 12:6, it says, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days, or 1,260 days. So that right there is 42 months, or 3.5 years. This is still dealing with the Great Tribulation. What Daniel was speaking of in Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 12, which we'll end up looking at that here in a minute, that is the Great Tribulation. What we see here in Revelation chapter 12, chapter 13, it is the Great Tribulation. The next verse that I want us to go to is chapter 10 of Revelation, and we're going to look at 1 and 2, and then verse 5. Okay, it says in chapter 10, verse 1, it says, and I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open, and he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth, and cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth, and when he cried, 7 thunders uttered his voice, or uttered their voices. So now what we see here, this angel right here, which we'll end up seeing in the book of Daniel, chapter 12 here in a minute. All right, this angel puts his foot, 1 foot in the sea and 1 foot on earth. Okay, well, we understand that the Jewish people were called the people of the earth. So he's between the Jews and the Gentile. He's like the go-between. Okay, this is talking, when we end up getting into it, he speaks blasphemies and everything. So it says, and when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. Now, in the King James Version, it says time no longer. In the New King James Version and other translations, okay, what we end up seeing is that it says there shall be a delay no more, meaning that time is here. It's time to go ahead and start having the Great Tribulation. Okay, so now if we end up going back to just reading that word, this angel standing there, let's go back to the book of Daniel, chapter 12. starting at verse 1. This is what it says, okay? And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. Now, this is a prophecy. This is what Daniel is seeing. It's talking about the time of the end. Okay, so it says, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time, future tense, talking about the Great Tribulation. Okay, and at that time, thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Well, what book? The book that the angel was holding in Revelation chapter 11. It says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they, in verse 3, and they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. This is happening during the Great Tribulation, okay? During those 3.5 years. It says, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. Verse 5, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on that side of the bank of the river. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? Verse 7 says, and I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time, when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. Now, if you notice, it says that he lifts his hands up to heaven and that he swears by him. Okay, this is exactly what we read back here in Revelation. Okay, so here we see that this is talking about the Great Tribulation, and that's what it's spoken of in the book of Revelation. It's talking about the Great Tribulation. Okay, and so we have to remember this. So the Great Tribulation is going to happen for 3.5 years, and this war that we're going to have, like I said, prior to the Great Tribulation, whether it happens just right before the signing of the covenant or right after the covenant. Okay, I don't see any common sense for them to sign a peace agreement and then immediately after that have a war. It makes more sense, and the Bible talks about using common sense. It makes more sense to have the war beforehand. Then the Antichrist would be able to come forth and have this peace agreement with Israel. And then, 3.5 years later, we end up having the Great Tribulation. Okay, so that's something that we have to look at, because we have to look at the timeline, and in the timeline, you have a 7-year period that the covenant has been signed, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Okay, we see this, and it says that in the middle of that covenant, talking about of that week, all right, which is 7 years, the covenant is going to be abolished. Now, what happens during that first 3.5 years, okay, is that the temple will be rebuilt, and it's going to be on the Temple Mount. Now, you have the Western Wall, okay, the Kotel. Many people call it the Wailing Wall, okay. To a Jew, that's offensive, because the reason why it was considered the Wailing Wall to begin with is because it was never in our position, or it was never in our possession. Okay, but once it became in our possession, it went from the Wailing Wall to the Western Wall. Okay, so when you refer to it, make sure that you refer to it as the Western Wall. Now, the Western Wall was never part of the temple. It was just the inner part of it, or the outer part of it. The temple sat inside. This was just a wall that surrounded it. Okay, now the thing is that what we come to realize is that the temple is going to be established, and it's going to be built during that first 3.5 years. because we have during Revelation chapter 11, if we would, let's go there to Revelation chapter 11. And we're going to look at the scripture clearly shows us that it's going to be sharing the Temple Mount with the Muslims. Okay. And when we look at scripture here, we see that there is going to be a shared peace treaty where the Temple Mount or the temple and the Dome of the Rock is going to be there. It's going to be side by side. There's enough room, if they put it up in the corner, that we would be able to build a temple. And scripture clearly lets us know that it will be a shared covenant or a shared Temple Mount. Okay. In Revelation chapter 11, starting at verse 1, it says, talking about the two witnesses, it says, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. And the holy city shall they tread underfoot 40 and 2 months." So we see here that's during the Great Tribulation. Okay. So, but the thing is that he says, so we see here that he says, look, he says, measure the temple, measure the men that are here. Okay. Their stature, the type of person that they are, measure the altar, take measurement of all of that, but do not worry about anything outside of that, because that's given to the Gentiles, talking about Islam. Okay. So they're going to be in control of everything else up there, but we're going to have a place to worship God. Now, so we end up seeing that. So it's going to be a joint worship mountain, so to speak. Okay. And so in seeing that, we have to realize that we're going to have the covenant, which lasts for 7 years. And in the middle of that covenant, you've got the abomination of desolation that Daniel had spoken of, which we see Paul mentioning in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And then it's mentioned again here in the book of Revelation. Okay. And so then at the end of that 3.5 years, or that 7-year period, you're going to end up having Armageddon. That's when Jesus returns. Okay. And you have Armageddon, and Satan is bound for 1,000 years. And then we have the millennial kingdom established here on earth for 1,000 years. And at the end of that 1,000 years, we end up having judgment. Okay. And then, after that, after the judgment, you end up having eternity. Okay. If you all have any questions, type them in and we'll try to, get them addressed if at all possible. Okay. So just to let you all know. Now, the thing is that what we have to realize is that during this time frame, that many things are going to happen. Okay. Next week, I want to get into when is the rapture going to happen. Okay, that's what I want to talk about next week, because it's, to me, I believe that it is of importance for us to know these things, that we have to be ready. The disciples of Jesus asked him, they said, when shall these things be? In Matthew chapter 24. And he says, this shall not happen, except, the sun doesn't give its light, the moon turns blood red, and the stars fall from heaven. Okay. So we end up seeing different things. And I want us to look at, when are we actually going to be caught up out of here? The rapture, as the Latin term, as some people call it. So I want us to be able to really understand scripture in this part, because it's important. Are we going to be here during the Great Tribulation, or are we going to go, be taken out prior to the Great Tribulation? There's 3 different views on that. You have your pre-trib, post-trib, and your mid-trib, which is right in the middle. The majority of Christianity is either the first one, is the pre-trib, or the last one is the post-trib. So we're going to look at that from a biblical perspective next week. Okay. So we'll be back next week. I want to thank you all for joining. My email that you all can contact me at is rj12231967@gmail.com. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them or comment. If you like, this video, smash that like button and subscribe. And I hope to see you all next week. And God bless.